why should voters pick Mike Lee over Tim Bridgewater?
Because I'm a proven, consistent conservative. And my conservatism is based on lifelong beliefs. It's also based on a 223-year-old document that doesn't change, because it's not supposed to change, at least except in extraordinary circumstances that are very difficult to go through. That's where my conservatism lies, and that's why it's reliable. That there are differences in our backgrounds, as you point out, that go further than just the lawyer-businessman dichotomy. My opponent has in the past supported No Child Left Behind. He did that when he was a candidate for Congress. He's since repudiated that position, and quite to his credit, and he has worked with the state of Utah in order to improve its own education system, and I applaud him for that. But he previously supported it. That's not something I would have ever supported. He previously expressed support for the Medicare Modernization Act of 2003, which had an unfunded entitlement liability of about $18 trillion at the time it was passed. He's since retracted or gone away from that position, and I applaud him for that. But he did support it back then. Now, both of those things have in common the fact that they were popular among Republicans. They were being advocated by Republicans at the time they were passed. That's a real risk we have as Republicans, I believe. When certain ideas start to gather momentum within the party, we do need conservative Republicans who are willing to step in and say, look, just because a Republican president or Republican leadership in Congress or both are pushing this, that doesn't mean it's an idea that we as Republicans ought to be supporting, and I, for one, am not going to, and I, for one, would never have supported either of those. His business background is another area of distinction. He has advocated and profited from and made a substantial portion of his living obtaining government funds for private business interests, including $1 million that he obtained recently in federal taxpayer dollars that were sent to Indonesia to fund a feasibility study for a geothermal power plant in Indonesia. Now, he sits as a commissioner on the power company in Indonesia that I understand was the recipient of those funds. And so there are things like that that indicate that he has a pattern of obtaining government funds for private business interests. And this one just happened to be government, U.S. taxpayer dollars going overseas to fund private business venture. Look, that's not illegal, it's not immoral, it's not unethical. But it does reflect a real difference in our respective viewpoints as to the role of government, as to the role of the federal government. I would never support something like that because I don't think that's right. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's within Congress's proper role. And it certainly would betray my conservative principles rooted in the Constitution.
When we've asked him about that specifically, he says that it generated $200 million in export business in Utah and I think in Vermont, I believe.
That $1 million in a feasibility study has generated...
I guess ultimately, if they build the plant, it will generate $200 million in export,
look,
manufacturing export.
There are an infinite number of business plans out there, as to which someone could promise $1 million invested will yield $200 million in returns. There's no end to the number of business plans out there where people might be able to suggest that. But is it the federal government's job to roll the dice? I mean, that money was appropriated not too long ago, just a few months ago, as I understand it, and certainly hasn't generated that yet.
Right.
I doubt highly that the study has even been completed. But if it has, it certainly hasn't produced $200 million in returns to the United States. But at the end of the day, we have to ask the question again, is that the role of government to take someone else's money and give it to a private business interest? Because government can't create wealth, it can just redistribute it. That's what it's doing here.
Yeah, I understand you've represented clients as attorneys who've received federal funds, large amounts of federal funds.
Well, I'm sure I have, because I've represented corporations, and corporations sometimes do that.
Would you have advised them not to accept that money?
I certainly have never assisted them in doing that. None of them have ever consulted me on whether or not they should do that. That's not really. It's not why they retained me.
Right. Okay. If they were to ask you, would you tell them, don't take it?
I'm not going to engage in that kind of hypothetical speculation.
Can we briefly, we're almost out of time, but can we briefly discuss your position on EnergySolutions? We've talked about it before. My understanding is that you feel that the state has exercised the authority it has to regulate the importation of foreign waste. Is that correct?
I wouldn't state it quite like that. I want to rephrase that. I want to make sure I understand what you're asking.
Well, the state has licensed the EnergySolutions facility, and at that point, its authority to determine the origins of waste is basically complete, correct?
Right.
And
under a line of cases known as Philadelphia versus New Jersey, under the Commerce Clause and in light of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, and Article 1, Section 10, states don't have authority to control imports and exports, and Congress has authority to make those decisions, not the states. So when a state decides it wants to license a particular type of disposal facility, regardless of the type of waste, it can't discriminate based on the origin of that waste unless Congress has authorized it to do so.
Could they have repercussions in other areas? I mean, other waste streams, other types of waste? I'm not talking about necessarily high-level waste, but blended waste, things like that EnergySolutions might want to import and dispose of.
You know, I'm not familiar with that issue. It's my understanding that stuff is regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but I'm just not sure. I'm not.
But if the nuclear
I've represented this company in only one case, right, and I'm familiar only with this one case.
Okay. But if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission says it's okay for them to take this, then the states having licensed that facility would be.
Well, if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulates that, then that's a power that hasn't been delegated to the states and would be deemed preempted by federal law. But if it hasn't been, if that's part of the agreement state status, if the state says it's okay, then the Nuclear Regulatory Commission wouldn't get involved. But anyway, the principle that I'm talking about non-discrimination, I don't think that has any application in that.
Okay.
But I'm really not familiar with that issue.
Okay.
It's just this one case that I represented.
Okay. Is that inconsistent? I mean, your opponent has said you're all over the map on this issue. Do you feel like you're inconsistent with this issue?
No.
That you support that you say the state doesn't have the authority to restrict it, but then you would support legislation that would allow them to prohibit it in the future?
No, there's nothing inconsistent about that. And if anyone's saying otherwise, he doesn't understand what my positions have been. They're entirely consistent. I helped lead the battle for Governor Huntsman in keeping spent nuclear fuel out of Utah's West Desert. Now, that didn't involve the import-export clause. That didn't involve Congress's authority versus the state's authority over whether or not a certain type of material can be brought in from outside the United States. That involved an entirely different set of questions. In this instance, we have a state-regulated, state-licensed facility that operates, that takes waste from all over the United States, and then that same state tried to say, although you can take waste from anywhere in the United States, you can't take any material from outside the United States. The litigation I was involved in dealt not with the question of whether or not it's a good idea to bring this stuff into the United States. That's a question for Congress. It dealt rather with who is the appropriate government authority. Is it the states, or is it the federal government? And I believe it was the federal government, and the federal district court agreed.